All right. Well, I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Prestolt. I'm Deputy Director here at the Advocates for Human Rights, where I also direct our International Justice Program. We're really pleased to welcome you tonight as we talk about this very timely issue and talk about the local, national, and global response to the crisis, the human rights crisis in Afghanistan. I am joined tonight by my colleague, Sarah Brennis, who is the director of our Refugee and Immigrant Program, and Elizabeth Lacey, who is a program assistant with our Women's Human Rights Program, as well as our International Justice Program. So we thought we'd get started just by talking a little bit about the Advocates for Human Rights. If we could go to the next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with the Advocates, we are an international human rights organization that works on the local, national, and global levels on a number of priority issues. And this particular human rights situation definitely involves a number of the different priority issues of our organization. Tonight, we'll be talking primarily about migrant rights and women's rights, but also touching on some of the international community response that that we work on through our advocacy. Can we go to the next slide, please? So before we get started, I wanted to say just a little bit about how the Advocates works, because it is kind of a unique approach for a human rights organization. The Advocates works on two levels. We work on both the individual direct services level as well as the systemic change level. So this is a unique approach that really grounds our policy work in the lived experiences of our partners and our asylum clients, and really puts the human in human rights. So, for example, we advocate for making human dignity the guiding principle in U.S. immigration policy. But when our clients experience injustice, we help them advocate for changing the systems and the governments that perpetuated the injustice that forced them to flee their home countries. When our partners in other countries report barriers to safety and security, we help to identify the gaps in legal protection and develop solutions that will bring about change. On the individual level, the Advocates protects the dignity of asylum seekers, of trafficking survivors, and unaccompanied minors through our legal services. And we have both legal services staff as well as many, many pro bono volunteers who are involved in providing direct representation. Next slide, please. So when a human rights crisis like what is happening in Afghanistan comes along, we respond as an organization on many different levels. We advocate at the international level for protecting women and girls, human rights defenders, civilians, and other groups. On the national level, we're working to get Congress to pass an Afghan Adjustment Act. And this will provide the opportunity for all Afghan evacuees to have a clear path to permanent legal status rather than individually applying for asylum and joining the already overburdened and backlogged process. And Sarah will be talking more about that shortly. On a local level, we are providing free legal clinics to individual evacuees who are being resettled here in Minnesota. So you'll be hearing all about this work tonight, but just have to say that none of it would be possible without financial support. So please donate if you can, and you can do that simply by texting AFGHANS, Afghans, to 44321, or click on the link in the chat to donate. So let's get started. What has been my piece is to sort of provide the bigger context, and then we'll focus in more on the local response. So I'm going to start by talking about the international community response. Now, as you've probably all been following in the news how as things unfolded in Afghanistan with the withdrawal of NATO and the U.S. forces and the surprisingly fast takeover of the Taliban, the international community response was unfortunately very limited. The UN political organs especially were disappointing in their response. The Security Council did pass a resolution, but it was weakened by abstentions by both Russia and China. And of course, Russia had a long history in Afghanistan before the US got involved. At the Human Rights Council, which is an area where the Advocates has an active practice in international advocacy, the Human Rights Council held a special session in August and did pass a resolution that was adopted without a vote. That was Human Rights Council Resolution S311. And essentially, it was very disappointing because it was a weak consensus resolution. It was adopted without a vote, and it called for further reports to the Human Rights Council, but it failed to establish an independent mechanism to monitor ongoing crimes under international law and human rights violations. So that's what the High Commissioner for Human Rights within the UN system and a number of other large non-governmental organizations and much of the human rights community was pushing for, and that didn't happen. But in terms of the continuing reports to the Human Rights Council in the session that just happened in September and early October, the High Commissioner did report on give an oral report on the update in Afghanistan. The Human Rights Council did vote to appoint a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. And that's important because it is a dedicated mechanism to monitor and report back to the Human Rights Council. So it raises the level within the UN human rights system. Other bodies within the UN system have been much more active and engaged. And just to give you a couple of examples, the UN Special Procedure Mandate holders, which are independent experts that are appointed by the Human Rights Council to either look at a country situation, in this situation in Afghanistan, or a thematic mandate. A large group of Special Procedures Mandate holders in August called on member states in pretty strong terms to take immediate and preventative action to prevent further human rights abuses from happening. The UN specialized agencies, many of them are on the ground and actively working in Afghanistan. So UN Women is obviously working on the rights of women and girls. The UN High Commission for Refugees, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the World Health Organization, a number of other agencies continue to operate in Afghanistan and are trying to address the humanitarian crisis there. And the UN is committed to continuing to do that work, but they are facing some pretty dire funding issues. There have been some examples of private corporations stepping in. Interestingly enough, the Lego Corporation has been providing a lot of money to help with some of the assistance to refugees and internally displaced persons within Afghanistan. But there's a lot. There's a big gap in terms of available funding. So finally, the Secretary General and the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, that's run under the auspices of the Secretary General, has committed to be involved. And their focus is really on getting humanitarian assistance to all of the areas in Afghanistan, as well as providing assistance to women and girls. So that's where we are in terms of the international community response. Perhaps not surprising that it's been slow and not as strong as we would like to see. But I also want to talk about the current situation in Afghanistan. There, since the conflict and withdrawal of U.S. forces in August, thousands of civilians have been killed, including being killed by having been targeted by the Taliban and Islamic State attacks, as well as from U.S. and former government airstrikes. That conflict has been worsened by a drought that's happening, so a natural disaster, and that has caused increases in displacement, which has overwhelmed some of the humanitarian efforts. And the country's economic system and health and education sectors are in near total collapse. Food prices have risen. Banks are closed. There's limited access to cash. And then again, the international community response in terms of freezing assets and issuing sanctions has had an impact on the economic system and access to food. But I think it's really important to remember that that the country was in a near crisis even before the Taliban takeover. And just a couple of things that I would highlight. More than 30% of the country was facing acute food insecurity before the Taliban takeover. Now that's estimated to be over 40%, but serious problems existed before, and they've only gotten worse. And UNICEF reported in December of 2020 that almost half of the children under 5, so that was approximately 3.1 million out of 7 million children in Afghanistan, were acutely malnourished and in need of acute nutrition services. So there were serious problems that were there before all of this happened, and now it's gotten worse. So major human rights concerns that have been highlighted by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in her recent report, as well as some of the independent experts, include reprisals against former security personnel and civil servants and their families. The Taliban has reportedly been doing house-to-house searches, even though there were public statements that they were going to grant amnesty to former civil servants and security personnel. But they've been doing house-to-house searches, arbitrary detention, and extrajudicial killings. We don't have good information about the numbers on that, but there's good information that it has been happening. Taliban forces have also reportedly been using increasing violence against protesters and journalists that are covering peaceful protests, including using live ammunition, whips, and batons. And there have been limitations on freedom of movement, with very few refugees allowed to leave after the last airlifts happened. Of particular concern, though, is the approximately 3.5 million internally displaced persons within Afghanistan. And there's also been increasing targeting of ethnic and religious minority groups within Afghanistan. So lots to worry about. And Elizabeth is going to talk now about, in a little more detail, about the human rights violations against women and girls.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. As many of you are likely aware, the situation for women in Afghanistan has rapidly deteriorated since the Taliban takeover in August of this year. But as Jennifer mentioned, it was already starting to be a dire situation. Initially, the Taliban promised that they would uphold women's rights, even that they would permit women to work and girls to go to school. But that promise is in stark contrast with the reports of what is actually happening on the ground. Since August, the Taliban has issued and carried out several orders that directly violate women's rights. As Fawzia Koofi, former Republic peace negotiator and first woman deputy speaker of parliament, put it at the UN Security Council, since they have taken over, there has been a systematic exclusion of women from the social and religious sphere. So with respect to women in the workforce, the Taliban fired all women in leadership positions in the government, and they also replaced the Ministry for Women's Affairs with the Ministry for Vice and Virtue, which formerly housed the religious police, who would carry out beatings and other reprisals against women who were seen walking without a male companion or not wearing a burqa. The Taliban have also prohibited most women from returning to work, and women fear leaving the house even if they're still allowed to go to work. Amidst reports of officials going door to door looking for them, women lawyers fear that the Taliban will kill them for their work in the last 20 years. Women judges similarly fear for their lives. Some have escaped the country while others still live in fear of confrontation with the men that they put in jail who have now been released by the Taliban. Further, during the past 20 years, as Jennifer mentioned, there is kind of an economic crisis going on as well. And many households over the past 20 years have become reliant on women's salaries. And now, as women are barred from returning to work, this has become a financial crisis for many families, especially single mothers. The Taliban similarly has not delivered on its promise to keep girls in school. They have closed several girls' schools, and this fall they have permitted only boys to return to secondary school. Taliban officials have also banned coeducation, which will create another barrier for many more girls to return to school. According to the UN, 4.2 million children in Afghanistan are not in school, including 2.6 million girls. Though the Taliban has said that their restrictions on girls' education are only temporary, the initial ban has made the future of girls' education uncertain at best. Women attending university may face a similar fate. Several universities remain closed to everyone, not just women. Professors and other university personnel have also left their positions in droves, fearing a Taliban crackdown, and the regime has begun replacing university leadership with individuals that will carry out its own agenda, which probably will include not allowing women to return to school. One professor was quoted in the New York Times as saying that his students were, quote, disheartened, especially the girls, because they know that they will not be allowed to go back, unquote. Outside of school and work, the Taliban has also cracked down on women athletes and artists. One woman volleyball player was allegedly killed this month. Some, like the Afghan girls soccer team, have been able to escape. They and their families have now settled in Portugal, and that's about 80 of them, I think, total. One Afghan woman summed up the whole situation in a recent foreign policy interview, saying, "Life seems impossible for women." As Jennifer mentioned, human rights defenders, including women, also face violent reprisals under the new regime. Even before this takeover, since 2020, Afghan women journalists and activists have been targeted and killed more frequently. Between September 2020 and May 2021 alone, 17 human rights defenders were killed and 9 journalists as well. And now women human rights defenders are at even greater risk. Some have received death threats and fear leaving their homes. Some have tried to escape the country, and others have been killed. Similarly, journalists trying to cover resistance to the Taliban also face retaliation in the form of threats, beatings, and torture. For instance, Taliban officials recently beat 2 journalists who were covering a small women's protest against the regime. Journalists have either fled or told women journalists to go home out of fear of violence. In fact, 70% of media outlets have closed in the months since the Taliban rose to power. And this is certainly an alarming blow to independent media in the country and will only put human rights defenders, women, and any other opponents of the Taliban at more risk of abuse. And now I'm going to pass the baton to Sarah, who's going to talk about our legal clinics.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So to start off, I'm just going to talk a little more broadly about the airlift and the evacuation and the spaces on the bases and the disbursement of individuals resettling across the United States, and a little bit about what we know about some of the legal options that individuals had. And then later in the program, we'll talk more about our efforts with the legal clinic and advocacy opportunities. So as many of you know, the U.S. airlifted over 100,000 individuals out of Afghanistan this past summer. And they've been making their way to the United States mostly through what are called lily pads in other parts of the globe. And about half of the individuals have been dispersed on a number of different military bases throughout the U.S. And there's a map here that shows you where those are. The closest to us, and the one with the largest number of individuals, is at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin, where there are about 13,000 evacuees that are staying there as guests of the U.S. government and are receiving some assistance getting situated with their legal status, as well as receiving services to be preparing them to be resettled in other parts of the United States. And there's another map here that shows you some of the destinations. Some of the key destinations are places where there are a large Afghan community already, and that's where a lot of people are wanting to go, a lot in California, Texas, Virginia, but that also means that those areas are pretty much at capacity in terms of offering resettlement services. Initially, there were some limitations in the services that would be provided to individuals, but now the federal government has offered the 90-day resettlement services for Afghan evacuees, the majority of which are entering as with humanitarian parole, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's some things that the U.S. government is doing well and trying to prioritize and really honor the commitment to carry through with the evacuation and allow people to be in the United States. The swiftness of the whole process didn't allow for people to be processed as refugees in many instances. Individuals who are processed outside the United States as refugees spend a long time waiting until they can actually come into the United States. So the U.S. Used a tool called humanitarian parole to allow people to enter the United States on what is really a quasi-legal status. It essentially allows people to apply for a work permit, and then they issued parole for 2 years. So they're able to stay in the U.S. temporarily for 2 years while they assess what legal options they may have to remain in the U.S. Or decide if they would like to go elsewhere, which we found in speaking with some people on the bases, they didn't intend to come to the U.S. They had family actually in other parts of the world. So that's one of the good things is they issued the humanitarian parole. The challenge is that it is temporary. And so many of the individuals have to decide if they can apply for something, some permanent status now. Sometimes people are coming, they're highly skilled and there's employment-based options that they can pursue. Others might be applying for asylum, and that's another space where the U.S. government has set some priorities to process individual Afghans who are applying for asylum, and have said they committed to processing them in 45 days. Our understanding is there's been maybe less than 10 individuals who have applied so far. I know here in our jurisdiction, if someone applies for asylum, they're not even conducting interviews yet. So we'll see if that ends up being carried out in the way that it was promised. But I think one of the points of concern that we have certainly is that there's a priority on processing Afghan applications. There's also a very big backlog for other individuals who've applied for asylum and are waiting for their cases to be heard. So while the prioritization is important from our perspective and knowing that we are committed to working with a large number of clients already receiving services from us, knowing that sometimes there's significant trade-offs. So as I mentioned, many people who come with humanitarian parole can also apply for a work permit. The good news is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service on many of the bases, they're helping people complete and start the process to process those work permit applications. So that's the good news, that while people were on the bases, they were able to fill out the applications. And in many cases, the applications were even approved before people left the military bases. The downside is all of the actual work permit cards were sent to the International Organization for Migration that's located in DC. So they have just boxes and boxes of work permit cards that now need to be sent out to people. In most cases, they're trying to send them to the resettlement agencies once they're leaving. So we're expecting a really significant delay in people actually getting their cards that they do need in order to be able to apply for employment. The other group of individuals that were in what we've seen really in the first wave of individuals and families who are leaving the bases are those who were eligible for special immigrant visas that are specifically for individuals who worked as interpreters or worked for the U.S. government or contractors with the U.S. government while in Afghanistan. It is a extremely complex process. There are several steps in the process requiring people to contact their supervisors, confirm their contracts, have evidence to show that they worked for the U.S. government. And then typically they would file a petition while they were abroad and then be processed at the U.S. Embassy and enter as permanent residents. There was already a significant backlog. This has been a legal avenue for individuals who've worked with the U.S. government in Afghanistan for nearly 15 years. Yet there's about 70,000 applications that are still pending. So, and what we saw right before as plans were rolling out to evacuate, many people were trying to take some of the steps in the process. There were lawyers helping people file the initial paperwork that they needed. But in the departure, either, once the embassy was closed, people weren't able to have their interviews. Some people lost documentation or lost access to it, particularly using email accounts that required multi-step verification to phone numbers they could no longer use. Those are some of the issues we're seeing working with people at the legal clinic. Or in some instances, they destroyed the documentation that they may have had in order to protect themselves if they were stopped by the Taliban to not have that evidence on their person. So that's another group that, and really there's a very small number of legal organizations and attorneys who have experience working with individuals applying for the special immigrant visa. So this is an area where there's adaptations to help people continue that process while they're here in the U.S., but it's certainly a complicated piece and not easy to make referrals for people who are eligible. And then the last thing that I'll mention at this point is also seeing a lot of people, we see families that are together, families have been separated, people, almost everyone we're meeting with has someone back in Afghanistan who is in danger. And so there's another avenue for individuals here in the US who can sponsor someone and apply for humanitarian parole to allow someone to enter the US. Typically, and this is an option, a legal option that's been on the books for quite a long time. They typically see about 2,000 applications a year. They're probably close to 10,000 right now with the same amount of staff. So that's another issue and another complex process for people to try to apply to allow their family members to come here. So those are some of the issues and challenges that make it really important for people to be able to access legal advice in order to know what their current situation is and assess what their options might be in the future. So I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Yeah. Sarah, there was a question, if we go back to that slide for a second, there was just a question about the second map with the approved number of Afghan refugees by state. Are those current prior to the evacuation, or can you just comment on that map?
Yeah, so initially the resettlement agencies were asked about what capacity they had to provide these 90 days of resettlement services to Afghan evacuees. And so the resettlement agencies based here in Minnesota came together and looked at their resources, which, as you know, our refugee numbers have gone down in the past 3 years. So a lot of these agencies were really limited in terms of their staff. So they looked at what they could provide, and then they're in negotiations with the federal government and the other umbrella agencies to try to see what capacity they may have. We're expecting anywhere from this, at least 275, but it could be more than 2,000 people that are resettled Minnesota. And a lot of that's dependent upon how quickly people are working with the resettlement agencies and able to move to more stable housing that would allow them to provide additional services and the contracting they do with the government in that regard. There's also another program that was just coming out called a sponsor circle. And this is intended to be a space where private individuals can basically serve in the role of the resettlement agency. They wouldn't get money to do it, but they could offer themselves to help people apply for public benefits, help them find housing, and provide some assistance. So that program is just rolling out now, but the intention is to try to create more options for people to be able to move off the bases sooner rather than later. They've only moved about 10% of the individuals who are at the military bases off and into other parts of the country.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to take it back out to the bird's eye view again and talk a little bit about how the Advocates is reacting to this crisis. And again, as I said, we work on the individual level with the direct legal services, and that's the most immediate response. And so we'll come back to Sarah to talk about that. But from the sort of the big picture, how do we deal with this long-term intractable human rights situation that has then evolved into an extreme crisis? So there's a number of ways that the Advocates works to try to change the underlying human rights conditions that cause people to flee. I'm not very good with graphics, but I tried to show with this how it really does interact quite a bit. One of the things that we have been doing a lot more recently is involving our clients in international advocacy. And actually, we can go to the next slide. And this is something that we use our special consultative status at the United Nations in order to bring issues of concern up to the international community in many country contexts that can be extremely effective. So we definitely are already considering our options for, as we are working with asylum clients from Afghanistan, working, and of course, using information with their consent. But some of them are human rights defenders, and some of them just have direct experience with human rights abuses. And so making sure that information is then documented and communicated as part of our international advocacy. I mentioned that we have that now there's a special rapporteur on Afghanistan. That's an avenue for providing ongoing information, not only about the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, but also about human rights abuses that might have happened in transit and in the U.S. as a receiving country. So that's one opportunity to use those client voices. And it's been great to see some of our asylum clients who, just because they have crossed a border, doesn't mean that they stop being activists. And so being able to work with them and empower them to use their voices to change the conditions that force them to flee has been really a fantastic area of our work. We also have done, and this goes back to, more than 10 years ago, we started working with diaspora communities to document human rights abuses on the ground in the country of origin. And so our first report that was exclusively based on human rights fact-finding and reporting from members of the diaspora was Human Rights in Ethiopia through the eyes of the Oromo diaspora. And that was a context where there was little access to human rights information on the ground in Ethiopia. So it was literally information that people in the Oromo diaspora here in Minnesota were able to get from their relatives. And so this report has been used in, I don't know how many asylum cases in the US and Canada and Europe. But that's also something that we are considering in our response to the crisis in Afghanistan, because Elizabeth and I talked about the situation on the ground there, and there's very little information that's coming out outside of Kabul. So being able to work with some of these Afghan evacuees to do the fact finding and monitoring and documentation, I think is going to be a really important thing. And I just wanted to flag a resource that we developed out of that experience. Is called Paving Pathways for Justice and Accountability. And we just put the link in the chat for that. That's available on our website. But it's a manual of human rights tools for diaspora communities to work on changing the human rights in their home countries. So I think with that, we'll turn it over to Elizabeth to talk about how we work with our partners.
Yeah, so one of the things that Jennifer mentioned was working with partners and NGOs that are on the ground in the countries where we're working, or the countries that we're kind of monitoring. And so the Women's Program has partnered with women's NGOs in several countries around the world. We have several partners in countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Northern Africa. And some of those partnerships we've maintained for something like 20 years. That's the example of Bulgaria. For others, we're just beginning our collaboration. And so we work on a range of projects with those partners, including monitoring and documentation, trainings, and advocacy at the United Nations and other regional bodies. For instance, we have conducted a training institute called the Women's Human Rights Training Institute, or WRTI, and that's been going on for several years in partnership with our Bulgarian partners. And through that training institute, we build the capacity of women lawyers and other human rights defenders in the region to document and address human rights violations. The Women's Program has also worked with in-country partners to analyze domestic violence laws and provide commentary on ways to improve the laws so that they better protect women from violence and respond to domestic violence. So in the long term, the Advocates remains open to connecting with NGOs, whether on the ground in Afghanistan or in the diaspora, to establish partnerships with them. And this is, again, kind of the really long-term view. But by doing so, we can strategize alongside women's rights organizations about ways to galvanize the support of the international community and to build their capacity to do their important work. And I think Sarah is going to talk a little bit more about how we can respond.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're responding here. And I think this is a good note. This is a lot of heavy stuff to process and think about the reality that's impacting so many individuals. I think one of the silver linings is just seeing the response in the state of Minnesota. We are working in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the resettlement agencies and other providers in order to provide assistance to the evacuees. So there is a transitional space that's been set up as folks are leaving the military bases and working with resettlement agencies to find more permanent housing. And so we're sharing a space with a medical clinic and individuals that are helping apply for people for public benefits. So we're holding a legal clinic 2 times a week to consult with individuals and families about their immigration situation, to help orient them, help them access paperwork that they need in order to assess their legal options, helping them apply for a copy of their immigration file, consider whether it makes sense for them to apply for asylum, and help them understand what it means in many cases for those who have humanitarian parole, and then also address some of the more nuanced situations. We have seen just in the haste that sometimes people are not given the paperwork that they need when they left the bases, or they have an option, but it's really changing day to day in terms of how policies are being implemented in order to facilitate people's applications for relief. So we're part of a number of national coalitions just trying to continue to follow what's happening. I think nationwide, we're really ahead of many others in having a legal clinic already set up. I think there was a response in trying to help people get legal orientation at the bases, and that continues to be ongoing. There's a number of organizations and volunteers that are at the different bases and providing people with general information, but just due to the sheer numbers, it's extremely challenging to try to give people individual consultation. So many are encouraging people to find legal services once they're in their resettlement cities. And that's exactly what we're doing through the legal clinics. So we are working with, we've been able to bring on a few temporary staff to help coordinate, and then also working with a number of volunteers, immigration attorneys who are available to meet with people virtually in order to review their documents and ask them questions and understand what their legal goals are. So that's been something. We're in week 3 of the clinic and working out some of the details and helping things flow. There's about 60 people that have been resettled in Minnesota, and so we're working through connecting with as many of them who are that are interested in accessing the legal clinics. And then the other piece is the fact that there are a lot of individuals who were already here. They're not part of this evacuee group that's getting services from resettlement, but in fact, they're in some other, they came to the United States, may have been in some other legal status. Many students who are from Afghanistan and are interested in applying for asylum. So we're also meeting with those individuals to assess what their options are, given the changes in the country, and many of them many women that were seeking higher education and concerned for their safety if they have to return at the end of their studies. So we're also assisting those individuals and pairing them with volunteer attorneys in order to be able to seek more permanent protection here in the United States. So if we have learned anything in our nearly 40 years of experience here at the Advocates, we know that we have to be nimble and respond to emerging needs, but also have to be committed to the long game. So we reflect on the fact that we were nimble 5 years ago when we saw an influx of Central American families and children starting to arrive in 2015, and that continued to come. We more than doubled our docket responding to that need. But right now, 5 years later, 75% of those cases are still pending, and we're still assisting volunteers and helping those individuals that are seeking asylum. And so when we think about the families and the children, we've seen families evacuated together, families as large as 10 people that are now having to navigate what might be straightforward paths to a more permanent status. We're all hoping that there is an Afghan Adjustment Act, but that won't just magically make everyone permanent residents. They will have to file an application in order to make that happen. And we can share some information. There's some action days if you're interested in advocating for the Afghan adjustment on November 9th and 10th. To share about that. We've also seen individuals that had to leave their entire family behind. And so they're trying to figure out how do they move forward, how do they provide for themselves, and also create a path for their family. And I think what we know is that that is, even though something might be straightforward, it can be complex, but in any regard, it's not going to be fast. And so we appreciate the support from all of you, and we continue to seek funding from funders who are prioritizing this work now, which is certainly important, but it will still be important 5 years from now as we try to respond to both this immediate need, but know that people are going to need us for the long term in order to really see their cases through in what is a long-term process, and hope to see through the government's commitment to provide some safety and security for these individuals that they've evacuated. And it will be both long, hard work with individuals as well as advocacy to hold the U.S. government up to its commitment.
All right, I think we have time. If there are questions, you can put them in the chat. And I think there was one question about the current status of resettlement in Minnesota, which I think Sarah has covered.
Yeah, I think the last time we checked in with the resettlement agencies, I think that they understood that the prioritization of the resettlement of the Afghan evacuees will slow down what was predicted to be an increase in resettlement of refugees from other countries that they were preparing to assist. So I think time will tell. And like I said, they're trying to negotiate and hire more people to be able to provide those resettlement services. But it appears that the Afghan evacuees will likely take priority over some of the other refugees that were intended to be resettled.
And you said there were currently we have 60 evacuees who are already here. Are they primarily in the Twin Cities? Are they?
Yes. So the resettlement agencies are primarily resettling individuals and families in the Twin Cities, in Rochester, and in the St. Cloud areas. And they're the main resettlement agency is the Minnesota Council of Churches, Arrive Ministries, Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Charities, International Institute of Minnesota. And I just also add, it's a unique opportunity. We're used to working with asylum seekers who have very limited access to the services of resettlement agencies that are typically able to step in to resettle people who are arriving or to work with individuals after they've been granted asylum. So I think this is really proving to be a good example of how important it is to work in collaboration and acknowledge just the assistance that individuals need before they're legally recognized as refugees or receive that asylum status here, when in practice they're similarly situated to those who are brought into the United States as refugees or once they've been through the long process of seeking asylum. So we're hoping that this will turn into a longer term commitment by the agencies in Minnesota to include legal services as part of the priority resettlement work.
Absolutely. How do you address the language translation issues?
Yes, certainly. Pashto and Dari are the main language needs. It was interesting when we went to Fort McCoy. There were a lot of people who had worked for years for the U.S. government as interpreters, and then were providing interpretation services for the legal consultations there. In the clinic, the Minnesota Department of Human Services has been coordinating the interpreters. We've also started to get inquiries from individuals interested in volunteering as interpreters. We know nationwide there'll be an exponential demand for those services, where on the other hand, many, I think, unique to some of the other refugee flows, that among them are many English speakers and many individuals who will potentially be able to work in the field of interpretation and translation if they're interested, and have met with a lot of a lot of individuals who are proficient in English, given their background and just how long the U.S. has had such a large presence in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that is a unique situation. So there's another question about going back to the work authorization cards that are all in DC at the IOM. Can these evacuees who have arrived start working without those cards?
No, so in some cases, and we don't know if, the advocacy efforts may result in them saying, okay, yeah, their cards will be sufficient. Time will tell, but typically for someone who has humanitarian parole, they're eligible to apply for work authorization, where they have what's called an I-94 card, the form number that shows their parole status, but then they have to apply for a work permit. Whereas someone who receives asylum, they also have an I-94 card, but they can use that card without applying for a work permit in order to work. But as it is now, these individuals wouldn't be able to apply for a job. The other issue as well is they've changed the way that the form itself to apply for the work permit. Now there is an embedded opportunity for someone to apply for a Social Security card. And at the beginning, they were using an older form, and so someone would get the card and then they had to apply for Social Security card. Now I understand more recently they're using the newer form that is also making those Social Security cards be delivered to that location out in DC. And all that is on that card is a name and the Social Security number. And so when you think of the thousands of people there that may have similar names, sorting them out is just, going to be a challenge, I think.
And there's another question so what happens if someone applies for asylum and the application is denied? What's the thinking with, can you return someone to Afghanistan? What's the current thinking on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it might depend on the situation that someone is in. If they still have humanitarian parole and the application has been denied, then perhaps they'd stay in parole status. And there's a number of different countries where individuals are not returned to. In our experience, anyone who's applying affirmatively for asylum, and if they're not granted and they pursue their case before the immigration judge and the Board of Immigration Appeals and the circuit courts, it's usually at least a decade for everything to make its way through. So I wouldn't foresee anyone being the US even attempting to send someone back to Afghanistan immediately in those circumstances. I think they're certainly trying to vet individuals and identify those that might be removable for other issues, not just related to a denied asylum claim.
Great. Now I think I got all of the questions in the chat. Oh, I see there's one more. Are there any Minnesota groups volunteering for a sponsor circle program? Maybe if you can.
The program was just announced this week, so I haven't heard of any groups that have started the process, and I haven't seen much more detail beyond the announcement that it's happening. So that's I think we'll see in the next few weeks. I know that we certainly have had contact with individuals who want to help host people, particularly ones that they may have been in touch with on the bases. So they might be ones that would be interested. I think there's a lot of pause that some folks have, really wanting to make sure that there's opportunities for people to have other avenues in order to get off the bases, but also make sure that those groups are supported and able to provide the services that they're committing to as well. So we'll see.
Right. Then one final question. So many have been paroled in with humanitarian parole for 2 years. what happens if Congress doesn't act, and asylum, and you don't file for asylum? What happens after 2 years to parolees?
That's the big question. That's what we don't know. And, that's why we're working really hard to help people see what options might be available to them and help them have tools in their toolbox to ask the questions or to assess what options may become available. Because if there isn't a special adjustment act, then they would be left with whatever opportunities or remedies we already have on the books under our current immigration laws.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this before, but this is a really complicated process. Even when it seems like it should be straightforward, it's a really difficult thing. And so I know it's been a long time since I practiced asylum law, but I remember encountering people. I represented somebody in detained court who was a U.S. citizen, came as a Cambodian refugee, and never, who's a minor and never adjusted. And so committed a minor crime and ended up spending more than 3 months in detained in ICE detention. So the work that you're doing is really important in helping people sort through all the different options and making sure that they have that legal representation. So thank you for all the work that you and your team are doing on that. So we'll bring things to sorry, Sarah.
No, I was just also going to say that this is an exciting opportunity, and I'm grateful to have had Jennifer and Elizabeth here too, because this is a unique group that will be seeing and having these opportunities to work with individuals to shape both futures of families that are here in the US, but also hopefully help them to continue to find ways to advocate in the international sphere and with those that are back home. So this is really kind of a great opportunity for us to use our unique model and use all of the different tools that we have to help defend human rights.
Yep, absolutely. So with that, perfect closing. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Again, if you want to support our work on Afghan's human rights issues, the text information is in the chat. We also have a number of different virtual human rights series that are coming up. So please get involved with that. We have some events, as you can see, coming up for the 16 days to end gender-based violence and for International Human Rights Day. So join us for that. And thanks to all of you for being a part of the human rights movement, because it really does take all of us to work together to make change. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.